Hello, and welcome to the Other Minds podcast. This is Joseph Bohigian, popping into your feeds with a special bonus episode, a recording of the pre-concert talk from our Other Minds 30th anniversary celebration with pianist Marc-André Hamelin and composer-author Kyle Gann. You'll hear a panel discussion between Hamelin, Gann, and Other Minds artistic and executive director Charles Amerkanian about the subject of the night's event, Charles Ives' Concord Sonata, followed by a lecture by Kyle Gann about the piece, drawing on his research for his 2017 book, Charles Ives' Concord Essays After a Sonata. After the episode, head over to the Other Minds website, where you can watch a video of Marc-André Hamelin's performance of the Concord Sonata at Mills College at Northeastern University in Oakland, California.
Thank you very much. How wonderful to see all of you tonight, and so many friends from past events that Other Minds has produced. A lot of composers in the audience, a lot of performers, and a lot of people who are on our record label. It's a wonderful reunion to see all your faces again. And I am particularly proud of this evening's event because it's kind of a one-of-a-kind opportunity for us to hear a rarely performed masterpiece that has really changed the face of American music, that was in its way a kind of revolution that was only discovered many years later after it started to be performed. And we'll hear all about that from Kyle Gann, who is the author of this wonderful book, Charles Ives' Concord, Essays After a Sonata, which is a kind of play on the Charles Ives book, Essays Before a Sonata, that he sent out explaining what the music was so that people would take it seriously. Kyle is also the vice president of the Charles Ives Society, which publishes Ives' work and tries to keep it alive. And he is a member of the faculty at Bard College. He was born on November 21st, 1955 in Dallas, and shares a birthday with one of my favorite eccentric composers, Pelle Gudmundsson Holmgreen from Denmark, who was at one of our festivals and is an amazing spirit who left us recently. He's also born 10 years to the day before the Icelandic composer Björk. And she chose well, Kyle. And Kyle is also the author of a number of very important books on Conlon Nancarrow, Robert Ashley, John Cage's 4 minutes and 33 seconds, and he has composed a microtonal theater piece called Custer and Sitting Bull, and fully 1/4 of his music is in microtonal tunings, including Hyperchromatica, which is for 3 retuned computer-driven pianos. It was released on a 2-CD set from Other Minds Records, and it's quite a spectacular thing to hear. Marc-André Hamelin was born on John Cage's birthday in 1961 in Montreal. And he has a brilliant international performing career as a pianist and has recorded over 70 albums, mostly for Hyperion, a London label, and including a brilliant performance of the Ives Sonata, following on an earlier version that he released on New World Records. He's a collector of piano scores and often records less well-known repertoire from the 19th and 20th centuries in his releases. And he's just returned from London, where he recorded a full CD of his own music, including a toccata on L'Homme Armé, a barcarolle, and his Paganini variations. We look forward to hearing that, Mark. When's that coming out?
Oh, these releases take about a year now, so it was just done. So next
but
January,
it's going to be
probably.
in CD form,
Yes.
not an LP.
That's right.
I would like to begin by asking both of you, selfishly, because I have a good story about it also, how did you discover the Ives Concord Sonata?
Well, it's astonishing. Kyle and I both discovered it the same way. We were both 13 years old, and we both heard it through a recording, the same recording, which was John Kirkpatrick's second recording, which came out on Columbia in 1968.
Kyle, how did you encounter this music?
Well, when I was about 5 years old, I read Little Women by Louisa May Alcott and fell in love with reading. And before long, I was reading Hawthorne, and I discovered an Emerson and Thoreau, and my mother was a piano teacher, and I was raised on classical music, and I asked her one day whether there was any American music, and she said, yeah, I think so. There are these guys named Charles Ives and Roy Harris. And so she had a music history book. I ran to it. I found Charles Ives had written this sonata about the Alcotts and Hawthorne and Emerson and Thoreau, and I was immediately awestruck, had to run out and buy it, and very soon after that bought the score, and could not make any sense of it, but I listened to it and listened to it and listened to it till I started to hear more in it than just the Beethoven's Fifth theme.
Well, my story is that I was at Fresno State College, and I was an accounting major, and I was walking down a hall in the administration building, and some teacher in one of the rooms was playing a recording of the Concord Sonata, which I knew already, and but I didn't know why it was being played in the business building, and it turned out to be the folk music collector and performer Eugene Bluestein, who taught in the English department transcendental literature, and he's playing the sonata, of course, for the students. And I walked in, just sat down in the back of the room, which you didn't do in those days. That was very rude, but I couldn't resist. And at the end of the class, I walked up to him and I said, what's going on here? What is this? And he explained that the English department had courses like this, and that if I knew what was good for me, I'd walk across the green and change my major to English right now. And I did it, and I got to study with Philip Levine, the poet who is nationally known as one of the great sort of writers of the Iowa School, the confessional poets around Robert Lowell. And the English department was fantastic at Fresno State in those days. And so I went up to the music librarian at the college, and he had the score of the Concord Sonata, and he said, look, we've got two of these. This one is now discarded. And he crossed out Fresno State College and put discarded, RJH, Ronald J. Harlan. And so this was legally mine now. And I went home and tried to follow it with the recording that I had, which was on Time Records. It was
Alois Kontarski.
Alois Kontarski. And there was a flute and a viola. And we're not using those alternative parts, but we'll hear from Kyle about all of that later. Let me ask you, why, Mark, do you play this from memory? Why don't you use the sheet music when you're performing?
Because it came into my life early enough that I could. I wouldn't even attempt something like that now.
It's so extremely complex that when I first heard it, I thought it was just a jumble of notes, and that fortunately there were these little passages that I could latch onto. But Kyle, what was your first response? Were you confused, or you just stuck with it until you understood what was going on?
Yeah, I did. I mean, I was getting into a lot of 20th century music at the same. I bought the Rite of Spring about the same time, and I could kind of understand the Rite of Spring. It went dun 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 like that, and I thought, okay, I can understand that. But the Concord, it was and as I'll talk about in my lecture, Ives liked to compose pieces backwards. Complex part at the beginning, simple part at the end. And so by the end, you get all the keys you need to hear the beginning of the piece. And, the Alcotts is the movement everybody starts. It's often played by itself. It's a lot clearer than the other movements. And it's really the key to the other movements in a way. So.
It's also a fabulous encore, by the way.
Yeah.
Oh, you use it
quite
as an
seriously.
encore. Really?
Oh, yeah.
Huh. Well, why not?
Yeah.
It's a great idea. You had not encountered Kyle's book until fairly recently. Tell me a little bit about what it was like to suddenly pick this up after working on this piece for all those years. What happened?
Well, I had read other material about it that was written about it, and of variable degrees of insightfulness, I guess. But when I came across Kyle's book, I was really so gratified and quite astonished by the fact that he really hasn't left any stone unturned. Any nugget of information that you're wondering about this piece, it's there. It's you can find it. I kept asking myself repeatedly, oh, has he touched upon that thing? Because I had a few questions, and I'm wondering, did he mention this in every single case? The information was there.
How many 13-year-olds are familiar with Emerson and the Alcotts? And this is kind of a peculiar situation.
I remember when Neil Armstrong stepped on the moon, my mother came and dragged me away to watch it on TV. I was reading The House of the Seven Gables by Hawthorne. I don't really remember the moon landing, but I remember reading that book.
What are your thoughts about Ives' place in American music now? Do you want to say something about that globally?
Well, it's very complex because in a way, Ives was, he was so much more modern than anybody at the time, but he was so modern so early that he came out into the world with a very romantic vision of music. And after World War I, everything changed so much. And so all the modernists who came after Ives had very different aesthetic, much more pared down, cleaner, more abstract, stuff like that. So in a way, and I think so Ives' music, its influence really emerged in the 1960s, because the 1960s was a lot about pluralism, different styles being mixed together, vernacular influences on classical music, things like that. And so it really emerged much later. And there's a funny range of real reverence for Ives in the classical music world and real antipathy toward Ives in the classical music world. I think you get, and especially within the composing field, you get people on both sides of that.
My second recording of Concord, I paired it with Barber's Sonata, and from what we know, apparently Barber really had a total disdain for Ives. He thought that he was a totally disorganized, sort of messy composer, and who didn't know how to put anything together, I think. So I feel a little bad about having produced this coupling, because I didn't know that piece of information at the time. If I had, it would have been a different recording.
But the beginning of the Barber Sonata is, when you play it, is pretty aggressive, and it doesn't sound like what we think of as the lyrical Samuel Barber.
Oh no, it should be. The beginning should be, I think. Yeah. After that, it becomes much more mellifluous.
Are you, Kyle, thinking that the research that you've done on the Concord Sonata, for instance, finding the recording of the 1939 premiere, and all of the scholarship that you put into this, is there more to be found out?
Well, I guess there are always new frameworks for analyzing the piece. I am very, very evidence-based. I'm trying to figure out how Ives thought. There are other people who might take some kind of more formalistic approach to analyzing the piece. I don't think there's much left to be found out about the manuscripts. There are 8,000 and something pages of Ives's manuscripts.
Have you seen them?
Yeah, a lot of them.
What was that like?
Oh, they brought me out went to Yale, and they brought out a box with Ives' manuscript of the Concord Sonata in it, and I felt like they were kind of criminal just putting this out where I could touch it. It was such an awe-inspiring object.
Could you actually touch it? And
yes.
No gloves or anything?
No.
We've been to different libraries, I see.
Magnifying glass supplied. I could go through, I went through his manuscripts. Is that a dot on that note or is it not? Stuff like that. And everything has been poured over so thoroughly. I mean, I'm in the Charles Ives Society. Ives Society has a continuous history going back to when he died and left us the money, because Ives was a rich man. He could afford to fund a society devoted to his work. And so the people I work with all worked with, a lot of them worked with John Kirkpatrick. So there's a very continuous history.
And he was the
guy who premiered the Concord Sonata.
Yeah. One last question. When you think about the role that Henry Cowell played by publishing scores of a lot of American composers at a time when those scores were not available and there was no opportunity for Americans in the late 20s to have their music published, the fact that Cowell then taught Lou Harrison and John Cage, there's a kind of through line going back to Charles Ives. It's kind of astonishing. And I was talking recently with Electra York, who's the daughter of Nicholas Slonimsky, and she said, Charles, don't forget to mention that a certain individual conducted Ives' music in 1927 and paid a big price for it and got blacklisted. But there is a connection to other minds in that this revolutionary work kind of broke open expression for composers in our country and gave courage to people to think for themselves in the way that Emerson would say to trust yourself, don't just copy other people.
There was a question? Well, Ives was... Cowell and Copeland, I think, ran the American music world in the 1920s between them. And Ives was kind of lucky that he was adopted by both sides, because there was a lot of side-taking back then. But Copeland was very interested in Ives' music, and actually, I think, did a better job of making it public than Cowell did, because he picked some of the more conservative songs and performed them at Yaddo, and he got really famous from that. So, whereas when the parts of the Fourth Symphony were played in 1927, everybody thought he was crazy. So, and the conductor, after the premiere, somebody asked the conductor how he thought it went, and he said, after I gave the opening downbeat, I have no idea what happened.
Well, I think it's a good time now to take a listen to your talk that you prepared on this subject, and Mark has graciously offered to illustrate some passages that you want to discuss with the audience. Then, when we come back from intermission, we will have a bit of a context for appreciating the whole four-movement piece, which is listed on page 5 in your program, the various movements. So please, Kyle, Mark.
Well, I'm glad to have already gotten a little of that off my chest. So, one of the things to keep in mind about the original reception given to Charles Ives was that in January 1921, he was known in the business world as the CEO and co-founder of one of the most successful insurance agencies in the country, Ives and Myrick, which is a subsidiary of Mutual New York. And very reclusive, well known in that world. And so you have to imagine how surprising it was that month he mailed out 200 copies of a piano sonata he had written to 200 strangers. This is almost, it's not quite because he wasn't that well known, but like if Mark Zuckerberg suddenly wrote a piano sonata, people would be very dubious, I think. And they were pretty dubious about Ives as well. Also, he sent it to people whose names he had gotten from Musical Courier magazine and a publication called Who's Who in American Music. And so ironically, he sent it out to lots of really famous, well-established musicians who just thought it was crap, who were predisposed to not pay any attention to it. Whereas there were lots of young composers, lots of musicians around who would have been really interested in it. And in fact, one of the most poignant stories in Ives' life, in 1924, George Gershwin became very famous for Rhapsody in Blue, and that year he ran across a copy of the Concord Sonata and called Ives up to tell him how much he appreciated it. Ives and his wife were on vacation in England at the time. A message was left at the insurance office, and when Ives got back, he never returned it. Again, in 1934, Gershwin tried to contact him again through a friend, and Ives somehow could not bring himself to meet Gershwin. I always think it's a very poignant story. Ives had been, at the age of 15, the youngest professional organist in the state of Connecticut. He was a very, very precocious performer. And he went on, he studied composition at Yale. There was no music major at that time, but he studied composition with Horatio Parker. And then in 1902, he had a big concert in New York and he put his most conservative music on it, and I think was so disgusted by it that he quit the music, but he quit his job at the Presbyterian Church in New York where he was playing organ, and apparently retired completely from the music world. And so from then until 1921, very few people knew that Ives was still making music. And he had very few musical contacts that he could talk to. One of the surprising things about the piece was that the four movements are called Emerson, Hawthorne, the Alcotts, and Thoreau. It was very unusual to write a piece based on American authors, especially ones that recent. Emerson and Louisa May Alcott and Bronson Alcott were still alive when Ives was a kid. And so there was a lot of doubt about this weird piece of music that's based on philosophical ideas of American authors. He also was so afraid that it would be misunderstood that he wrote a book called Essays Before a Sonata and sent it out with copies of the sonata itself. And Essays Before a Sonata, I love it dearly. It's a weird book. He never says anything about my music. The word sonata appears 5 times, 2 of them in the first sentence of the preface. He talks about his ideas about Emerson, about Hawthorne, and he develops kind of a whole aesthetic of music in the last chapter, or an aesthetic of art in general based on lots of different philosophers and a lot of Ruskin influence and people like that. And it doesn't actually seem to say anything about his sonata. So it's a very strange mix. In the 1930s, Ives wrote up some memoirs called Memos, and in there he says that he got the idea for the Concord Sonata in 1911 when he was vacationing at Elk Lake. Elk Lake is a beautiful little pristine resort in the Adirondacks. I visited it for research. It's expensive to try to follow Ives around to resorts. Because he had a lot more money than I do. But he went there frequently. He was diabetic. This wasn't known until 2014. He kept his diabetes secret because back then, if you got diabetes, they gave you 6 years to live. And people who had it didn't want to admit it. So he told everybody he had a heart attack. And in 2014, a writer named Stephen Budiansky found a letter Ives had written to a younger composer who also was diabetic and admitted that he had diabetes, that he called it a heart attack. And then in 1924, insulin shots were invented, and Ives started getting them in 1930 and then lived for another 24 years. So very precarious health for the last decades of his life. But the earliest sketch that we find for the Concord Sonata that we can actually locate to the sonata is an interesting page for flute and piano that has a melody on it and a repeated series of chords running underneath it. And that passage ends up in the Concord Sonata, or it, much changed. But Ives wrote about how Thoreau liked to play the flute over Walden Pond. And so he put this idea in a flute, which in some performances of the sonata, you can have a flute comes in at some point and plays that theme. And so this is that theme from the end of the Thoreau movement. That theme at the beginning of that seems to be the earliest idea for the sonata. He had already been working on some other works. He worked on an Emerson concerto from 1909 to 1911. He never finished it. It has been finished and performed. It's kind of an ungainly work. He said that he had at one point worked on an Orchard House overture about the Alcotts. He had done some work on a piano concerto having to do with Hawthorne, and he had started a chamber piece about Thoreau. And in 1911, he had the idea of combining all of these different authors in one piece and using that theme to unify the entire piece. But that theme does not come in its entirety anywhere in the beginning of the Concord Sonata. As I said over there, Ives had the idea of starting from complexity and then gradually moving toward clarity. I think this is the most original thing about his music, because classical music, you always have the theme first, then it gets developed, you get variations on it and things like that. Ives worked the other way around. He often introduces motives and fragments of the theme in the context of thicker contrapuntal textures, revealing more and more of the main theme as he goes along. And he said of his third violin sonata, the working out develops into the themes rather than from them, which is a pretty common strategy with his. This seems to model after the form of a discussion or thought process wherein the idea is muddled and inchoate at first and becomes clear in the working out. Of course, this is a fiction created in the music, because nobody would write a whole bunch of complex music hoping that a theme will finally emerge. That would be quixotic. So obviously he came up with the theme first, but then he makes it as though the idea just appears at the end. And so we don't really hear this melody in its most complete form until the end of the third movement, which is the Alcotts. And there it sounds like this. In the Ives literature, this is universally called the human faith melody because of something that Ives writes about this movement in the Essays Before a Sonata. He says, all around you, under the conquered sky, there still floats the influence of that human faith melody, transcendent and sentimental enough for the enthusiast or the cynic respectively, reflecting an innate hope, a common interest in common things and common men, a tune the conquered bards are ever playing while they pound away at the immensities with a Beethoven-like sublimity. So he mentions Beethoven in connection with the Concord bards. Actually, there was a lot of interest in Beethoven among the transcendentalists in mid-19th century Boston. And he quotes Beethoven quite obviously in the middle of that theme for very well-acknowledged reasons. So this melody runs through all four movements. In the first movement, Emerson, we don't hear the melody. You can split it up into two halves, and in Emerson, we hear it played in two different keys. Each half played against the other in two different keys. If you're not familiar with the Concord Sonata, the best thing to do at the beginning is just let it wash over you, because Ives is trying to confuse you. And on the first page, he plays very quickly, almost some of them at the same time, 6 themes that are going to run through the movement. And he's trying to just... He had his idea of Emerson's writing was that Emerson was this very volcanic, chaotic writer. And he said, as thoughts surge to his mind, he fills the heavens with them, crowds them in if necessary, but seldom arranges them along the ground first. So I don't get quite as complex a feeling from Emerson as Ives did, but he was trying to write music that sounded the way he thought Emerson read. And so just after like the first introductory paragraph of the piece, you get the two halves of the human faith melody played in different keys at the same time, like this. Now, the Emerson is a tremendously complex movement, and a lot of people have found it very confusing, but it's really written in a series of episodes. There's material at the beginning that comes back at the end, and it's all cut up into episodes in the middle. One of them I call the verse theme. Ives thought the movement was divided up between verse and poetry because Emerson wrote a lot of both. And the slow movement, or the slow theme, I call the verse theme, and it's kind of a second movement for the sonata. And all these themes are based on the same pitches, by the way. They're very, very simple relationships among them. Each episode climaxes has a big climax based on either the Beethoven's fifth theme or the Emerson theme, except for the central episode, which I call the nature episode, because he's got a really high tune going over a kind of repetitive accompaniment in the bass that builds up an overtone series, or as close as you can get to it on the piano. And nature, of course, was a huge theme for Emerson, and one of his most famous essays was called Nature. The Transcendentalists were obsessed with nature, and so for me, this is Ives' evocation of that. And also, at the end of the movement, you'll hear the halves of the human faith theme come back again, alternating back and forth between two very distantly related keys as it dies away. The Hawthorne movement is as complex and difficult as the Emerson movement, but it's written completely differently. The Emerson movement is very thematic. It's kind of you can sort of tell it was written by an organist, lots of themes going at the same time. The Hawthorne movement is a mosaic of little images. It's almost like Ives was basing little sections on different short stories by Hawthorne, which in fact is exactly what he did. And the conceit for the movement was based on a story by Hawthorne called The Celestial Railroad. Celestial Railroad was a parody, a satire of a book that used to be very, very famous, Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan from the 17th century. It used to be almost as widely read as the Bible. In Pilgrim's Progress, some of you know, if you're my age, it's about an allegory of a Christian going through the valley of the shadow of death, Vanity Fair, the Slough of Despond on his way to the celestial city. And in Hawthorne's satire of it, you no longer need to walk. Now there's a passenger train that will take you through all that. So you can just easily go from wherever you get to the celestial city without going through all, and carrying your sins on your back, you put them in the baggage car, and it's much simpler. And so Ives, there's a lot of train momentum in the Hawthorne movement, like this part. So if you think of that as being a choo-choo train, you won't be far off. There are a lot of references to Hawthorne. We don't exactly know what they all are, but there's one I feel very strongly about. In The House of the Seven Gables, the young woman who in the story is named Phoebe, and she has a garden, and the house is haunted by ghosts and shadows, and nothing ever grows except in Phoebe's garden. And there's a section that I think that has a beautiful white key lyrical melody, and above it there are these big black key clusters played with a piece of wood, and it got Ives caricatured as the man who plays piano with a stick. And I think this is Phoebe's garden. And there are a couple of places very clearly related to the Celestial Railroad that there are a couple of big passages of ragtime, or at least what Ives thought of as ragtime. Ives never wrote anything that really sounded like ragtime, but he loved the ragtime idea of accenting notes just before the beat. And he got into that in his writings. He talks about, he uses the rag as a verb. He rarely talks about ragtime as such. So in the midst of all this really frenetic ragtime, there are two places at which all of a sudden the music stops and gets really soft, and you hear a hymn in the piano. And what that corresponds to in the Celestial Railroad is these people are taking the passenger train to the celestial city, and they look out the window and they hear these pilgrims on the ground, trudging through the mud and everything, and they're singing a hymn as they go. And it's in the story, and I think it's very obvious in the music. It switches back to the train very abruptly like that. The movement culminates. There's a brass band that comes in like the big parade they're having when you get to the celestial city. And then he does kind of a fantasy on the old hymn, Columbia, the Gem of the Ocean, which was taught in elementary schools when I was young, but none of my students have heard it anymore. It's an old patriotic tune. Some of you will recognize it. The Alcott's movement is kind of the slow movement of the sonata. It's supposed, Ives says that it captures the domesticity of Orchard House where the Alcotts lived in the 1850s, where they finally had their own house to settle in for a few years. The movement itself is not always calm, though. There are some very calm, tuneful parts, but there are a few very anxious passages. And the movement, Ives was thinking about two members of the Alcott's family, or actually three. Louisa May Alcott, who wrote children's stories, and her father, Bronson Alcott, who is not nearly as well known today, but he was a philosopher, a close friend of Emerson's, loved to talk, did not write well, but was greatly praised by Thoreau and other people at the time. And you might think that the quiet parts are Louisa May Alcott and the big sonorous parts are Bronson Alcott, but actually Ives says at the beginning of it, at the piece, the first key signature in the piece appears here, and it's two key signatures at once. It's A flat in one hand and B flat in the other hand. And Ives says of this point, he says sometimes Bronson Alcott likes to talk over the fence in A flat while Sam Staples talks back to him in B flat. And Sam Staples was the sheriff in Concord who put Thoreau in jail for not paying his poll tax, which would have supported the Mexican War. Sam Staples offered to pay Thoreau's tax for him himself if he'd let him. And when a relative finally paid the tax, Staples had to force Thoreau to leave the jail. So Staples was a good guy. But anyway, this is that passage. So Bronson Alcott was supposed to be a very serene, very even-tempered guy. And some of you, if you know Little Women by Louisa May, trying to get the main character, Jo, to control her temper is like one of the main themes of the book, because Louisa May was apparently a very fearsome person. There's another hymn running through the movement called the Missionary Hymn that has some of the same intervals as the Human Faith melody. If you can. And there's a big climax. Ives, the Human Faith melody and this tune keep interweaving with each other, and there's one point, a climax at which the missionary hymn becomes very, very important, because Ives plays the third phrase but just changes one note in it. And then there's some parlor music in the middle of this movement that Ives talks about as being Beth and the Little Women playing the piano. Beth was based on Louisa May's younger sister, Lizzie. Lizzie died in her early 20s. In the book, Beth dies a little younger than that. She was the pianist in the house. Ives also talks about her playing Beethoven's Fifth Symphony on the piano, which we're pretty certain did not happen. apparently she could play some folk songs, Scottish folk songs were popular, hymns, things like that. So anyway, and then the movement climaxes by bringing the human faith melody back in. The Thoreau movement, the last movement, is Ives was more explicit about what the movement depicts than he was in the other movements. And the very opening, you got these little quiet arpeggios that represent the mists on Walden Pond. And as the Hawthorne movement is all about trains, Thoreau is all about walking. Thoreau reportedly liked to walk at least 8 miles a day. And so he takes walks around Walden Pond. And there are 3 of them, particularly at the beginning. They each start with the same quiet chords. And the first one, so you'll hear them, those come back 3 times, and the first one was this. Apparently Thoreau sped up a lot when he was walking. And then after these 3 walks, the music changes, and Ives says of this point, he is still aware of a restlessness with these faster steps. His rhythm is of shorter span. It is still not the tempo of nature. It does not bear the mood that the genius of the day calls for. It is too specific. Its nature is too external, the introspection too buoyant, and he knows now that he must let nature flow through him, and slowly he releases his more personal desires to her broader rhythm, conscious that this blends more and more with the harmony of her solitude. It tells him that his search for freedom, on that day at least, lies in his submission to her, for nature is as relentless as she is benign. And so then the music, a 3-note figure comes up out of the bass at a very studied tempo. And above it, Ives says there's a place where the oak tree wants to sing a phrase from Masses in the Cold, Cold Ground, an old Stephen Foster tune that was his father's favorite melody, and that's in a different key. So that figure dominates the second half of it. Brilliantly, Ives, because Ives was an extremely sophisticated composer. People have tried to paint him as an amateur, but he knew amazingly well what he was doing. The human faith melody does not, after its big statement in the Alcotts, doesn't appear for most of the Thoreau movement, or at least you don't think it does. But there's a little rhythm thing that keeps coming back over and over again over that. And it's drawn from the human faith melody, as he eventually makes clear. Human faith melody, part of it goes da 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 dum ba dum. And if you just take that last da 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 dum ba bum, that rhythm, he starts bringing in this little melody, dun 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 da dum da da dun dun da dum. And he keeps doing that over and over, and finally it turns into the human faith melody after a while. And he brings it in. If you do it with the flute, it comes in the flute and then dies away very mystically. I just want to close by saying I've come to think there's a philosophical program to the Concord Sonata. There is definitely one to Ives' Fourth Symphony, which he acknowledged, and which is somewhat based on Beethoven's Ninth. Beethoven's Ninth, there's a very angry first movement, there's a funny second movement, there's a very devout religious third movement, and then the tenor comes out, and sings, "Oh friend, not these tones." Others sing something more joyful, and they sing about man's love of humanity. The Ives Fourth Symphony, he does something a little similar. There's a chorus in the first movement that asks a question, "Watchman, what of the night?" And then the second movement, which is actually based on the Hawthorne material, is called a comedy. The third movement is a fugue, and it's very religious. And then the fourth movement is very cloudy and mystical. And I think in a similar way in the Concord Sonata, Emerson was a great asker of questions, and the first movement stirs a lot of stuff up and then has this big question at the end. It's very unsettled. Hawthorne and Louisa May Alcott were both fiction writers. Hawthorne provides the comedy. Louisa May Alcott provides the kind of religiosity of the parlor, this kind of home and domesticity. But it takes Thoreau to come out and answer the question more definitively by giving a very, very ambiguous answer, because Ives was very much took from Emerson the idea that vagueness is what you get when you get close to a perfect truth, that the perfect truths cannot be defined or put in words like that. So that this is one of the greatest piano works of the 20th century, as attested to by the fact that there are so many recordings of it. I've got over 40. I've found 45. Mark tells me that he knows of 54, so there are other ones out there. It's possibly been recorded more than any other modern piano work. And I really love most of the recordings. When I lecture on the piece, the one I use most frequently to illustrate what I'm saying is the 2008 recording of Marc-André Hamelin. So this is a tremendous pleasure to not have to play the recorder, just have him in person tonight. And I hope this little travelogue will deepen your enjoyment of the performance tonight. Thank you. Thank you.
That was Kyle Gann talking about Charles Ives's Concord Sonata. Head over to otherminds.org to hear Marc-André Hamelin's performance of the piece at Other Minds' 30th anniversary celebration on January 21st, 2023. Thanks for listening to this bonus episode of the Other Minds podcast, brought to you by Other Minds. If you haven't already, be sure to check out our previous episodes featuring interviews with the composers from Other Minds Festival 26, and subscribe to hear new episodes coming out later this year.